Hi, everybody. I'm Alice Marwick. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication and a principal researcher at CTAC. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. CTAC, the Center for Information, Technology, and Public Life, is dedicated to understanding the growing impact of the internet, social media, and other forms of digital information in the context of the people who use, design, and govern them. We're particularly interested in people, platforms, power. We take a holistic approach to studying technology, focusing on how social inequality and power structures shape the use, deployment, and impact of technology. We're committed to equality and justice in our scholarship, teaching, and dissemination of research. In that spirit, I'd like to take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization in our technology, systems, and society. Our center occupies the ancestral land of many Native people, including the Shakori, Eno, Tuscarora, and Lumbee, and remains home today to the Occaneechi Band of Saponi Nation. The university was funded in its early years from the sale of lands home to the Cherokee and Chickasaw Nation. I invite you to join us in acknowledging our shared responsibility to pursue reconciliation and justice. We are delighted today to welcome Nancy Leong here. Professor Leong is a professor of law and William M. Beaney Memorial Research Chair at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law, where she directs the Constitutional Rights and Remedies program. She has published extensively in leading law journals of topics of deep interest to CTAC, such as whiteness in American law, racial discrimination in platform economy businesses like Uber and Airbnb, and racial capitalism, which she defines as when white individuals and predominantly white institutions use non-white people to acquire social and economic value. In 2021, she published her book, Identity Capitalist with Stanford University Press, which expands on this idea to analyze situations and systems in which people in a particular in-group, such as white people, men, straight people, or the wealthy, capitalize on the identities and bodies of the out-group, who are color, women, LGBTQ individuals, or the poor. We thought Professor Leong would be a wonderful fit for our theme for this semester, Identity, Inequality, and Institutions. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Leong to CTAC.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you, both those physically present and those on the live stream, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about my work, specifically about my book, Identity Capitalist. I want to also thank CTAC for inviting me, and in particular to Andrea Lopez for fielding all my questions, my many questions, and just flawlessly coordinating this visit. So today I'm going to be talking about my book, Identity Capitalist, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2021. What I'm interested in doing in my work generally and in my talk today is in looking at how we as a society value identity. In particular, I'm interested in interrogating who benefits from the identities of marginalized people and why. So let me just dive in and start with an example to give us something to think about. So you are looking at two photos that are similar, but they're not quite identical. The photo on the left is the original photo. On the right is the photo, and I'm hearing the laughs, so I think people are seeing it. On the right is the photo as it appeared on the cover of the admissions brochure at the University of Wisconsin. And as you can see, there has been an addition. If we look behind the right arm of the woman in the white sweatshirt who has her arm uplifted, you can see that there has been an addition via Photoshop. Now, I want to note, lest anybody think that I have a grudge against the University of Wisconsin in particular, racial photoshopping is actually very, very common in higher educational materials. Here's another example. I'm going to limit myself to one more, although there are many. So when you glance at this photo, it looks like a photo of just four happy, racially diverse friends. If you look a little bit more closely, you can see that the Black woman on the right side of the photo is not standing light as the other three women. And I don't know if you're quite close enough to tell, but you can also see there are like some little white dots along the side of her face, where you would think the brick wall was. All right. So these are just a few examples of, I have a whole folder on my computer dedicated to racial photoshopping in higher education. And even when there's not actual photoshopping, I want to point out that research has found that the photos in college promotional materials are not exactly accurate. So a recent study looked at the photographs in the promotional materials of 371 colleges, universities, and what they found is that in these photos, Black and Asian American students were overrepresented by 50% on average relative to their actual presence in the body. All right, so what's going on here? In my research, again, I'm looking at the way that in groups, meaning groups who are powerful or dominant in our society, white people, men, straight people, wealthy people, the able-bodied, how they benefit from outgroup identity. Outgroup meaning people who are not men, people of color, people who are poor, other marginalized groups and communities. And so when I think about the interaction between the group that's in power and the group that is marginalized, ultimately, the way I want to describe this is by using the lens of capital. And while I framed my analysis in terms of capital, this is a word, of course, with many meanings. There's social capital, there's human capital, there's Marxian capital. There's an interesting book I think by Catherine Hakim called Erotic Capital. Many people have used the lens of capital. I want to resist the idea of attaching myself to any one meaning or connotation of capitalism and focus on the idea of one group benefiting from the other group in some way, either socially or economically or in some other means. So in my work, I define an identity capitalist as an in-group member who uses out-group identity to benefit themselves. And so in the example that I just described, the University of Wisconsin is what I would call an identity capitalist. It is an in-group member, a predominantly white institution, and that is using an image of a Black student who is a member of an out-group. In fact, at the time that this image was published, University of Wisconsin was less than 3% Black. So this in-group institution, this predominantly white institution, is capitalizing on the identity of this Black student. So this was actually a Black student. His name is Diallo Shabazz. He just had never been to a football game, right? So they took a photo of him in another context and thought it would look nice here. So when we think about what the University of Wisconsin is getting by capitalizing on Diallo Shabazz's Black student in this situation, I think that they are using his identity to benefit themselves in a number of ways. One is to make the campus appear more diverse. As I mentioned, the campus at the time. Potentially, this would attract other students of color to the campus. Very nice, diverse-looking campus. Students care about diversity. Perhaps that's something that's valuable to the University of Wisconsin. Maybe this makes the university look more appealing to other stakeholders, whether those are students, parents, donors, trustees, whoever that might be. And it also potentially gives the university status relative to other universities. And at a time when there are more ranking systems for colleges and universities and the programs within them than ever before, I think universities are really looking for any way that they can find to get a leg up, including capitalizing on members of their own body. All right, so with that framework in place, this idea of identity capitalism as members of in-groups who benefit from out-group identity, I'd like to bring forward a few other examples of identity capitalists drawn from public life. And the idea here is just to look at a lot of situations that you may have thought about kind of on their own and to bring them together so as to draw connections between them, to present a case that identity capitalism is a systemic phenomenon. Many of these examples are going to focus on the identity category of race. After all, I am a law professor and my legal expertise is race discrimination, but I do want to flag, and a few of the examples will reflect that the identity capitalist paradigm could apply to other identity categories as well. So gender identity, sexual orientation, class, pretty much any identity category. Anywhere you see an in-group individual or institution benefiting itself using identity. So let's start out by talking about the Rooney Rule. I don't know if you saw that one coming. As some of you may know, this is a photo of Dan Rooney, who is the former owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers and the former chairman of the National Football League Diversity Committee. And the rule that bears his name, the Rooney Rule, was created in response to troubling information about Black coaches in the NFL. So at the time the Rooney Rule was put into place, something like 70% of NFL players were Black, but only 3 head coaches in all the teams. And one study found that Black head coaches won a higher percentage of games on average, yet were less likely to be hired and more likely to be fired than were white head coaches. Since 1990, Black head coaches whose teams had won at least 9 games were roughly as likely to be fired as white coaches whose teams had won at least 6. So the Rooney Rule tried to change things. It required NFL teams to interview at least one non-white candidate for head coaching positions, as well as what are called senior operational positions. I don't know exactly what that would encompass. A little bit into the field of further into the field of football knowledge than I'm prepared to go right now. But basically, so the positions at the top, including head coach, it started out as they had to interview at least one Black candidate, and then as of 2009, it became one non-white candidate. This was not a quota. It was not a hiring requirement. It was a first-round interview requirement. For a few years, it looked as though the Rooney Rule was working. So by 2006, just a few years after the rule was put into place, the overall percentage of Black coaching and senior operational positions increased from 6% to 22%. But by 2020, things had backslid. There were only at that point 3 Black head coaches. That's the same number that there was at the time that the Rooney Rule was adopted. So why didn't this work? Well, one reason is that it could be circumvented pretty easily with sham interviews, meaning interviews where the team interviewed somebody that they had no intention of hiring in order to satisfy the requirement. And this practice was so pervasive that Anthony Lynn, who's a former coach for the Los Angeles Chargers, actually said on record that he turned down interviews with teams unless they had already interviewed a minority candidate because he didn't want to be the token. So if they had already interviewed a minority candidate, that gave him reason to think, at least there's some evidence that I'm not the token. So that's one reason, this practice of sham hiring. And I'll just add as a footnote, which we could talk about in Q&A, I think this is a problem in academia as well. Lots of nods, yes. So I think that there are situations where a hiring committee, let's say, realizes that the pool on which it's drawing, oh no, it's a pool of white men again. How could this have happened? And add, the hiring committee adds some racially diverse or gender diverse candidates to the pool. Maybe this is not sort of explicitly part of the discussion, but the candidates were not in the first cut, and more often than not, I know of no data on this because of rules affecting the confidentiality of these searches. But more often than not, one of the original candidates ends up being hired. So I think that this issue of sham searches goes beyond the NFL and the Rooney Rule. Another reason that it's widely thought the Rooney Rule didn't work very well is the lack of enforcement by the people in power, by the NFL. So there was only one fine ever in the history of the rule that came relatively early in the implementation of the rule. And within, maybe 5 or 7 years after the rule was adopted, there had been what looked to be some fairly significant, if not violations, incidents that should raise questions, right? Situations where white candidates were interviewed in person for a whole day, and candidates of color were given a brief phone interview or something like that. And there were a number of these situations where fines weren't actually imposed. So really, just lack of enforcement by the NFL seemed to play a role here as well. So although the rule has often been held up as a marker of the NFL's commitment to diversity, it appears that in practice it has served more as a signal of the NFL's commitments rather than as a tool for actually improving the level of diversity on the ground. So to return to the questions that I began with, who is benefiting here and how? Well, the NFL certainly is benefiting, or was for a while, because they get credit for their commitment to diversity, or alternatively, perhaps they now have a way of deflecting criticism for the lack of diversity. Oh, look, we have the rooming rule. We're trying, right? So are the teams who can point to the Black or other racially underrepresented candidate that they interviewed as a way of getting credit. Who's not benefiting? Well, the individual non-white coaches who are interviewed and then not hired, perhaps also the players, Black and other non-white players who might not even consider going into coaching if they think that this is a sham rule and the deck is stacked against them. Now, I want to flag that in 2020, the league modified the rooming rule to reward teams for actually hiring people of color for coaching positions with third-round draft picks. I think it was third round. So there was actually a more powerful influence was put into place. Now, I think it's a little soon to tell what effect this is going to have in the longer term, but I think it will be interesting to see whether this more direct measure, right, like this more direct incentive, is actually going to help to better diversify the coaching and other leadership. Okay, so there's an example from sports. Let's shift gears and talk about corporate America. So if you were on social media, Instagram, or pretty much any other social media platform during 2020 in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, this was probably a sight that you saw in your hand at some point. Many corporations spoke out for the first time about racial equality and police brutality. And you probably saw a lot of companies posting an image of a black square, or maybe a black square with some supportive text to communicate their support of racial justice. And in the wake of this racial reckoning, corporations, big companies have been trying to find other ways to signal their support for racial outgroups. Notice that I say signal their support as opposed to support, because I think that it could be one or the other. It's definitely, the signal is definitely there. The actual support, well, let's talk about that. So in many instances, this effort to signal support has taken the form of enhanced diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think that companies have done a really good job, just an A+ job at building up the DEI portion of their website. So to pick one example, this is, it might be a little bit small for you all, but this is Walmart's DEI page. And I picked Walmart, but really we could be talking about pretty much, right? Every company has a page like this. Some language about inclusion, about valuing their people, and then a lot of photos of racially underrepresented individuals, or individuals from racially underrepresented groups, women, maybe people with visible disabilities, right, in photographs. And so the idea here is that the company is working to portray itself as a diverse company, right? A place where you want to shop, or to do business, all in order to make money. Now, I want to note that Walmart has been sued many times by members of the groups that it represents on the dissection of its website. So this is a, and I think this is true of most other companies, by the way. But so this is a situation where what the in-group is gaining is damage control, right? In addition to promoting a positive image of the brand, they're also doing some damage control. And I think that this is a situation where the in-group is capitalizing on the out-group as a way of benefiting its literal bottom line, right? So this is a situation where the benefit actually is literal capital, in addition to social capital and other forms of capital. Well, so this is a situation where we're talking about literal capital. So you could go into that more, but that's probably a different topic. So I just want to make clear that this is an actual pretty direct economic benefit. I also, before we leave corporations, want to contrast the DEI page of the Walmart website with its leadership. And again, this is not as lacking in racial diversity and gender diversity as many other big companies. Like I'm glad that Fresh is here, right? But at the same time, there is just such a clear contrast between the DEI page that the company has and the leadership, like the people at the top, the people in power, people who are making all of the decisions, including, right, to have this DEI page first. And that's worth noticing. So we've talked about sports, we've talked about business. Let's talk about politics, shall we? So some of you may remember an incident from the first time that Donald Trump, presidential candidate, at one of his rallies, he pointed at a man in the crowd and said, excuse me, he pointed at a black man in the crowd and said, "Look at my African American over here." The black man, name of Greg Chadle, was not actually a Donald Trump supporter. He went to the rally because he was interested in hearing Donald Trump speak. And he later said that it was surreal to hear Donald Trump call him out like that. And although this is a particularly crass example of the way that Donald Trump draws attention to his support or alleged support, his claimed support from Black people and other relatively marginalized groups, like women and people with disabilities, it's far from the only time that Donald Trump has made a point of his support from these outgroups. Here he is showing off his support from women and Black people in the form of signs. So Donald Trump, right? He's an identity capitalist. So institutions like schools and corporations can be identity capitalists. So can individual people like individual politicians. As a straight, white, wealthy man, Donald Trump is almost the definition of an in-group member in pretty much every way that we could think of. And here, he's using outgroup identity in a few ways. First, to communicate that members of this particular outgroup support him, but also to benefit himself politically by countering accusations at the time, and these have only grown, that his campaign is racist or even white supremacist. Or if not entirely countering these accusations, he's to provide plausible deniability for workers. We've all seen him go on to do this with other Black people. Clarence Thomas, Ben Carson, with Omarosa, with Simon Silk. And this strategy, I want to point out, has also been popular with his supporters. For anybody who, for whatever reason, can't see, these are a few of many photos of white people wearing shirts that say Black. So it may be tempting to roll our eyes at this because Donald Trump is over the top and in many ways, but I want to emphasize that all politicians are identity capitalists to some degree. And I would even say that they have to be, whether they want to be or not, which again is something that might be interesting to talk about in Q&A, how a politician could ethically negotiate that. Because politicians, I think, are required to some degree to signal their support from marginalized communities, from Black, from Asian American women. But I want to emphasize that systemically, if not on an individual level, identity capitalism is changing the political landscape. It's changing what kind of candidates get attention and what they get attention for. Consider the strategy that Republicans have adopted for the upcoming election. Currently, only 16% of Republican members of Congress are women, and 9% are people of color. So we have a quote about how this is the leadership is trying to change this, right? So this quote is from a guy named Dan Constant, who's president of the Congressional Leadership Fund, which is the House Republican super PAC. And he says that, to paraphrase, this is a very intentional strategy. Like, Republicans are actively seeking candidates who are not white men, who are either people of color or women of color, or other minoritized identity groups. And it's worth really thinking about why Republicans are doing this. Like, are they doing it because they think that people of color and women deserve representation among the ranks of politicians? Well, that may be part of the reason, but I think it's also, and I would say most because of another reason, which is because they've learned that these candidates can win because they have a certain type of appeal. And the ultimate goal here, yes, some candidates of color and candidates who are women may end up being elevated in the process. But ultimately, all of this goes to increase the power of a political party that is still predominantly made up of straight, white, wealthy men, especially in the most powerful positions within the party. So again, look at who's benefiting and who they are benefiting from. And so this is identity capitalism as a political strategy. Although I want to note here how this kind of brings together economic value and social value, right? Both of these are present in situations where identity capitalism enters the political arena. All right. So I know that CTAP has public life in the name, but I thought that perhaps we could talk about private life for just a moment. And this sort of conversation might hit a little close to home for me too, and that's okay. So many members of in-groups take pride in having a racially diverse friend group. You know, I suspect that most of you at some point have heard somebody say something like, I can't be racist because my boyfriend is black, or I can't be homophobic, all my friends are gay, all of them, or you know, something like that. Well, why? Like, why do people say things like this? I mean, with respect to race, I would suggest that one reason is that white people and white adjacent people, which I would sometimes put myself in that category, are afraid of being called racist. Beverly Daniel Tatum, psychologist, says the word racist holds a lot of emotional power. For many white people, to be called racist, ultimate insult. So a racially diverse friend group is a way of defending oneself for white people against this ultimate charge of being a racist. The white desire for a multiracial friend group has been documented empirically. Research has found that white people tend to exaggerate both the number and the closeness of their friends of color. Do I have a, no, well, we could ask why. We'll get to that in a minute. But so let me just give you a couple of examples that I think really drive the point home. Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's a sociologist, has written a book called Racism Without Races, which I think is such a classic and highly recommended. But in this book, he interviewed white people about their friendships with Black people. And of those who he interviewed, a little more than a third claimed that they had Black friends who they characterized as either good friends or best friends or friends with whom they hung out. That's a quote, hung out. But after probing a little bit further, what Bonilla Silva found is that the strength of these friendship ties was a lot more tenuous than his respondents had originally admitted. So, for example, white respondents tended to otherize their Black friends, language that they use, distancing terms like these people or them. And tellingly, they often didn't or perhaps couldn't identify them by their first name. Additionally, the contact with these friends proved very superficial And it typically took place in the context of sports or music, or maybe the occasional like friendly conversation with a fellow student or a coworker or something. All these were characterized as friendships by the white people that Lydia Silva interviewed. And let me read a quote that I think is really telling that summarizes the study. Missing from these reports of friendships with Blacks is evidence of trust, of the capacity of confiding, and of interactions with these friends beyond the place or situation of formal or required contact, such as the classroom or an assigned dormitory or a job. So that's some qualitative evidence. Quantitatively, a law professor named Justin Pideaux looked at the social science data from the affirmative action at the University of Michigan that was brought forward in a couple of lawsuits filed in 2003 over the University of Michigan's affirmative action practices. So of the white students in the study, 92.4% reported having 3 or more close friends of other races. This was as compared to 37.3% of Black students, 29% of Latina students, and 53.4% of Asian Americans. So if you actually do the math, if everyone is telling the truth, if we take it at face value and everyone is telling the truth, then it must be the case that every student of color had 19 close friendships with white students. Now, is that possible? Yes. Is it unlikely? I would also say yes. I think it's more likely that the white students were exaggerating because they are acting as identity capitalists, like they are deriving some value from the identity of the non-white student that they are purportedly friends with. So again, we see in-group members gaining value from out-group identity. The white people are gaining social status by having, or maybe by claiming to have, non-white friends. Alternatively, the white people may be just deflecting charges of racism, or maybe the value that they're deriving is internal. They're making themselves feel better. So this is identity capitalism on an individual level, but still identity capitalism, in-group member benefiting from an out-group member. Okay, so now we get to 5. Where is this coming from? So in my book, I argue that there is a thread of similarity that runs through all of these examples. This is diversity as a way of gaining status or providing value to the people who are in power. And I argue that the impulse to engage in identity capitalism results in part from the importance that diversity has come to play in public life as a result of Supreme Court decisions relating to diversity. Now, I am a law professor, so here is going to make a brief detour to the Supreme Court. For the past 40 years, diversity, 40 plus years, diversity is the only rationale the Supreme Court has accepted to justify a race-based affirmative action program in higher education admissions, except for there's a narrow carve-out for correcting past discrimination by a specific institution that doesn't come into play very often. So really, diversity is it. This is the only rationale the Supreme Court has accepted. And one thing that this reliance on diversity has done is it has focused a lot of attention on displaying evidence of diversity. It's really become a high stakes endeavor, right? Like if this is the only thing that the Supreme Court will credit, well, it makes sense. There's a lot of energy going into it. So institutions, including but not limited to institutions of higher education, have certainly bought into diversity in the sense that they agree that there is value to be gained by having non-white people around. And by extension, diversity in relation to other identity categories, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. And I don't think that we can really fault advocates or colleges and universities for going down this road, because it's the only road the Supreme Court has left open. But it does leave some concerns if it's not done intentionally. So what I end up arguing in the book is that the emphasis on the appearance of diversity that the Supreme Court has created gives institutions a motive to affiliate with members of outgroups, but not necessarily a motive to do anything more meaningful to make the institution a better place for outgroup members. And this is actually a criticism that many legal scholars have raised in relation to the diversity rationale. So, for example, Derek Bell, who is an icon, one of the founders of critical race theory. In a 2003 Columbia Law Review article called Diversity's Distractions, he argues that diversity is a distraction from more meaningful examinations of inequality within institutions, the historical reasons for this inequality, and what can be done about that inequality. Now, just to be clear, and I want to be very clear here, especially as the Supreme Court considers whether to totally eliminate affirmative action on Halloween, perhaps appropriately enough. To be very clear, neither Derek Bell nor I is against diversity. I don't think diversity is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it's very important. But it's not the only goal, and I want to emphasize that I don't think it should be the only goal or the end goal. To understand the difference between diversity of the kind that identity capitalists often seem to be striving for and more meaningful substantive reforms, consider what diversity doesn't capture. And I'll talk about educational institutions. I think that's a context we're all familiar with. A school could be racially diverse, yet still be a school where students of color are not succeeding academically, where students of color are not thriving while they're students. It could be a school where students of color face pervasive microaggressions when they're in the classroom. It could be a school where students of color are not finding good career outcomes after they graduate. My law students just got their bar exam results, and I think that my school is kind of still looking at the data. I've been busy, so I haven't seen more than a headline yet. But at a law school, it could be a school where, despite the fact that a school is very racially diverse on paper and in photographs, students of color pass the bar at lower rates than their white counterparts. So, problems really arise when institutions focus on diversity instead of, as opposed to, in addition to, the types of substantive concerns that I mentioned here I focused on the book. So, we really need to look further, right? Like in a diverse group, how are historically marginalized groups treated and how do they benefit? Okay, so those are some examples and a way of thinking about them. Some of you, if you're like other audiences I've spoken with, might be saying, well, okay, but really, like, what's the problem? Should we be concerned? And so I think the answer is yes. I think there are a few here, and I'll talk briefly about three. The first concern is that identity capitalism can be very degrading to outgroup members. It can create a situation where outgroup members are treated as products or as commodities. So nobody wants to feel like their school only admitted them or their employer only hired them because they want to put their photo on the website and count them in the statistics. So there's a way in which identity capitalism makes members of outgroups feel like they aren't valued for themselves, but rather that they're just valued for the identity category that they are associated with, so that their school or their employer can benefit from having outgroup identity characteristic around. Closely related, I think that identity capitalism can foster resentment. So non-white people are not oblivious to identity capitalism. Recall the San Diego Chargers coach who I mentioned, who was very aware of situations where he might be being used just to satisfy the requirements of the Rooney Rule. So to the extent that non-white people perceive white people or predominantly white institutions as just using them for their racial value, this is going to be an impediment to improved racial relation. There's a way in which this cheapens interactions between members of the house. And again, I focused on race, but it could be true for, again, pretty much any identity category that's salient when it comes to diversity. I think my greatest concern, kind of the overarching concern with all of this, is that there is so much effort going into identity capitalism, like finding people to put in the pictures, and literally being put, as in Photoshop. Finding people for the pictures, like designing these websites. And my concern is that all of this effort is displacing potentially more meaningful anti-discrimination. reforms. And the effort that is going into identity capitalism suggests that this kind of social problem, like racism or sexism, big problems, are easy to solve. So it creates this environment where acquiring the socially or economically or otherwise valuable features of non-whiteness becomes the focus at the expense of real substantive efforts at reforming institutional culture. So for example, a school might say, we enrolled 10% non-white students this year. We get to put that on our website. We get to take pictures of these. We get to tell our trustees about it. That's enough. Things will take care of themselves once we're here, right? Like once we get the students in the door, we've done our job. Like we don't have to worry about whether the students are academically, if they're going to pass the bar, if they're going to get jobs. We get to put these students on display. Like we've got them in the door, and that's where it ends. And of course, that is not always going to be a recipe for success. All right, so if I convinced you that this is a problem, what do we do about it? Okay, so I'm going to present two ideas, and I have more suggestions, but I'm gonna focus on two for purposes of this talk. The first one relates to the idea of apology. People often resort to identity capitalism when something has gone wrong. Someone says that something was sexist, and then when that person is called out on it, the immediate impulse is not to apologize, but rather to talk about that person's wife and daughter, how much that person cares about women. The same thing is true, of course, for race and identity categories. My recommendation is instead to learn how to do what legal scholar Eric Yamamoto has focused on in the context of race, and what he calls a race apology, or we could more generally maybe call it an identity apology. So a race apology, as defined by Yamamoto, is an apology for an incident involving racial bigotry or discrimination or more serious historical wrongs. Yamamoto has put together a database of American and international apologies for issues relating to race. You might imagine it's a pretty long list, but it's instructive, and it has some lessons for us about what does and doesn't work. So some apologies are governmental, like the United States apology to reparations for Japanese Americans who were wrongfully interned during World War II. Congress made an apology to Native Hawaiians for the illegal overthrow of the sovereign Hawaiian nation. Other apologies are private. They come from religious institutions, like the Catholic, Baptist, and Mormon churches have all apologized for wrongs that were committed within their churches. Others come from entertainment, or just from regular people who are unfortunate enough to attract attention in the age of internet virality. So Yamamoto's analysis identifies some factors that explain why some apologies are effective and some are not. One key is that to be effective, an apology has to be costly to the apologizer, or to even the word some have used is mortify the apologizer in some way. Identity capitalism very much does not do that, right? Like there's a way in which saying, look at my Black friend, right, doesn't at all mortify a person for having said something racially insensitive. In other situations, expressing a commitment to do better in the future, or even potentially diminishing the status of the apologizer, are critical components of the success of apology. So the apologizer really has to have skin in the game for the apology to advance the ball. Research indicates that the structure of the apology is also really important. It should be victim-centered rather than what we might call offender-centered. And the apology that the United States offered for Japanese internment, while not perfect, I would never say that it was perfect, has many of the elements of a successful apology. So it was accompanied by legislation that was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. It was costly to the United States, both because the United States admitted that it did something wrong, that we really messed up. It also provided for $20,000 of compensation to each of more than 100,000 people of Japanese descent who were incarcerated in the internment camp. And the apology acknowledged wrongdoing, so it describes internment as, quote, a great injustice. that was, quote, motivated by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. And the reason I'm going into a little detail here is because I want to contrast the apology for the internment camps with what the United States government has done with respect to slavery. So the government of the United States has never offered a unified apology for slavery. Both the House of Representatives and the Senate have separately passed resolutions apologizing for slavery, but the two were never reconciled. They were never signed into law. And they explicitly excluded the consideration of financial reparations. So there was very little skin in the game here. And as a result, this apology was dismissed by many people as purely symbolic. And so after this uninspiring effort at apology, the identity capitalism that we see from many of our elected officials and aspiring elected officials is in many things more problematic, right? So real apology would acknowledge this history, the complexity of racial relations, and offer the first step in solving them. Identity capitalism just short circuits or tries to jump over that whole conversation by implying that this problem was already full, or maybe even this problem never existed first. I also want to talk a little bit about another strategy, which I'm just describing as honest. And I signal my ambivalence about how often this strategy is taking place right now effectively by using a stock photo of a group of racially diverse workers having a conversation. And so let's talk about real honesty, however often we think it happens. Let's just, indulge in the exercise. So we've seen today how much effort corporations put into managing their brand on social media by posting just images and content that portrays them as inclusive. What if instead corporations were just brutally honest about who they were and where they were at the time? So I'm going to read you a statement which I wrote. And just imagine the statement on a corporate website. Historically, we haven't been a very diverse company. We've been particularly weak in the area of racial diversity, and that's even within an industry that's not very diverse. We know this, and we know that we need to do better. We're proud of the fact that in the past 5 years, we've increased the number of people of color in our company by 30%, but that's not enough. We will not be satisfied until our workforce reflects America. Moreover, we know that it's important to have people of color in leadership, not just as employees. Right now, our leadership is only 12% people of color, but we have created a pipeline program to mentor people of color for leadership roles. Finally, we've implemented programs dedicated to broadening the pool of people who are interested in working for our company down the road. For example, we partnered with 4 local colleges to develop summer internship programs, specially designed to attract people of color who might not otherwise consider working in our industry. So what I've attempted to do here is to combine just a brutally honest statement of where a company is with things that a company might be doing. Now, assuming that it actually is doing the things that it says that it's doing, right, that this is actually a just 100% honest statement, I think it's interesting to think about how this might be received. I mean, I wonder whether it might be seen as a breath of fresh air, right? If the corporation actually, had I would say had the courage to attempt something. So what if corporations were a lot more honest, right? What if politicians were a lot more honest? What if all of us were? With that invitation to imagine, I think that's a good place for me to conclude. And I really look forward to your questions, comments, and your suggestions. Thank you so much.
Like to handle the Q&A, or would you like me to?
Oh, why don't you just do that?
Anyone want to kick off the Q&A portion of the conversation? All right, I'll take Lee and then Shannon.
Closer in space.
Okay, closer in space. I don't know what that means, but hi, thank you.
Sorry, I was a few minutes late. I want to take you up on your offer to talk about how politicians or political candidates or people running for office could signal affinity with identity groups, let's say, in a way that is not unethical, right, or is not engaging in. So I'm curious, like, what you.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell me. I was excited.
Oh, no, I mean, like, maybe some ideas, but I don't know. But I'd be curious to hear sort of what you think about it.
Yeah, so I think I see a lot of identity capitalism as prioritizing style over substance. And so I think that starting with the substance could be really helpful here, like saying, I will do this thing. And for all of the good consequences it will have, by the way, look what it's going to do for people of color or for women or for another marginalized identity group, right? And then rather than merely holding up a sign, the signaling support, or Donald Trump does this a lot, like and I've read stories about how it's intentional, like his handlers will find Black people in the audience and kind of bring them around, so they're like standing behind him while he's talking. So rather than doing that, inviting people who like the substantive reform that's being proposed to come and talk about the substantive reform and why they like the substantive reform. Because then you're not just showcasing the person for their identity, like, yes, this is a person of color, and there is a signal that this is something that would benefit people of color, and people of color are supporting my candidate's reason. But it's not just about kind of the bare aesthetics of the situation. There's some substance. That's one idea that I have, and I think that some politicians have done a pretty good job at this. I think others are still at the T-shirt that says, a certain group likes me stage. There's kind of a whole spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I'm intrigued by the idea of like the substance, right, of it first. But I also think it's also hard, right, because any candidate is limited by their own identity, right, in how they can then signal to others without enlisting others, right? And so there's like differential, I guess, like possibilities, right? Like based on one's own identity. So.
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely right. And, I'm just saying this is descriptively, not with a judgment attached to it. I think this may be why the Republican Party is turning towards candidates who are themselves members of marginalized groups, because then the person can speak on behalf of the community as opposed to speaking for them, right? Like there's a little bit of
Thanks. You're both awesome. So I'm gonna lean into the metaphor for a second of capital, and if I get carried away, I'm sorry, but do identity capitalists have like a class consciousness? And where I'm going with this is like, if we imagine that there's a surplus between the leveraging of identity and the benefit of it, it's partly because diverse identity is valued, but diverse people are not valued. And so like you talked about the Supreme Court case and how it like incentivizes superficial public relations style diversity, but it doesn't like incentivize substantive reforms or anything like racial justice. But maybe it's even more than that, and it like actively, if there's a class consciousness to identity capitalism, it actively like says we shouldn't do anything substantive because we need to sustain this surplus between valuing the identity for its benefits of showcasing diversity, but not actually elevating people. Because if we had racial justice, then we lose the cachet of their identity as an image.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing question. And I had not thought of it quite like that before. I mean, I could see how the class consciousness might come into play in other ways as well, like to the extent that identity capitalists kind of view one another as loose affiliates, perhaps seeing, oh, this worked for that school or that politician, maybe it would work for me as well. I think it's really interesting to think about to think about identity capitalists not only as a group of people and institutions that are engaging in a particular type of behavior, but as all of them in relation to one another. So I think that that's certainly a possibility. And you raise a really interesting point, which is that identity capitalists for identity capitalism work do depend to some degree on the maintaining of the status quo, right? Like if the status quo changes, then identity capitalism isn't going to work as well. And I think that that is a really great point, and one that I had not entirely thought of. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. I'm excited to think more about that.
I mean, I think it's probably like why we talk about DEI, we can't say like anti-racist, for example, when that's really what we should be meaning. So I mean, I think you're.
Yeah, I mean, DEI, I mean, I don't know how many people read Bakke versus Regents of the University of California, which is the Supreme Court case I mentioned that was decided in 1978, in which Justice Powell, actually writing only for himself, gifted us with a diversity rationale. But in that opinion, he talks about how the beauty of the diversity rationale is that it is inclusive of all kinds of, he mentions racial minorities, as well as some other marginalized groups, but he also mentions, for example, farm boys from Idaho. And so, I mean, I think that the diversity rationale might in some ways have been the acceptable solution because it didn't necessarily require doing anything that radical, like admitting farm boys from Idaho. Maybe not. Well, maybe at one point that was a radical thing, right? But I think in today's world, not such a radical. I think I leaned on the keyboard. Did I? Oh, it's fine. Okay, great. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. This was so generative for me. Like I kept just like writing down little examples of things that I could see. And like I'm the diversity advocate, for example, on a search committee that I'm sitting on right now. I feel like my role is to do exactly what you just described in the search committee. But I wanted to kind of take this like a step further. So I spent a lot of time during 2020 and 2021 when all this kind of performative identity stuff was going on. A lot of white people on Instagram thinking about the way in which white people and white activists, or just white people who consider themselves progressive, were taking up the concerns of people of color and the language of social justice and activism in a way that I think really enriched their own like status, right? In a way that they would sort of say things and sort of make these claims. And in some cases, I think not really be taking into account the fact that people of color are a very diverse bunch of groups with many different viewpoints, and that you can't say, well, I'm going to speak on behalf of people of color. And an example that I was thinking of was a video I saw from San Francisco. So my husband's a YIMBY, I guess, in my backyard, which is like all super like pro housing. And often YIMBYs are very, they often clash with some progressive activists who are very anti-housing development. And there was an example from San Francisco in which a bunch of white NIMBYs were basically organizing on behalf of people of color against affordable housing because they thought it would destroy the character of the neighborhood, whereas the low-income people of color who lived in the neighborhood were advocating for it. And the white people were using the language of diversity and social justice in order to sort of work at cross purposes, and were very like angry at the idea that anyone would call them racist. And so I think beyond, the examples that you've given are really powerful, but I think I think that it's like very easy to point this out when it's on the point of view of like corporations, right? Or like things like, Pride Month, where literally every corporation, like Exxon Mobil, like we love gay people, we hate the planet, like whatever. But I think when we think about how do people go even further than just like a simplistic view of diversity, like how do they actually think about like maybe engaging in anti-racist activism, or maybe like engaging in justice movement for their own sort of opportunism? Because I think that's completely underexplored, and in some cases even not acknowledged by a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think it's a hard conversation to have, because if people are genuinely like in their hearts, which only they know, but like if people are genuinely in their hearts appalled by what happened to George Floyd, right? And are kind of getting off the bench for the first time in terms of social activism. Just as a strategy, I think that we don't want to discourage that, right? But at the same time, how do we kind of give people credit for trying and encourage them to keep trying while pointing out that some of the things that you're doing are actually kind of co-opting the language of social justice and using it against, or the language and the symbols of social justice, using it against groups that are actually more disempowered. I mean, one of the things that I advocate in the book is just to view the project of self-education as never, right, to keep reading and to keep listening and to keep entertaining the possibility that you could be wrong or that you could be right, but that you're doing it wrong in the situation. So I think the more that we can build a process component into DEI or anti-racism or whatever you want to call it, like the more that it is not just about certain substantive things, although those are very important, but also about this process of examination and learning. I think that that would be a very helpful addition to those particular social. I mean, the example that you give, I had one other thing to say about that. I think that the example that you give is so interesting because I think that there's so many examples that are just like that. I mean, not like literally just like that in terms of the facts. Mari Matsuda, who's a legal scholar, a critical race theory scholar, who I'm seeing some thoughts, so maybe everybody already knows this, but she's talked about the idea of looking to the bottom, meaning looking to the most marginalized. And so I think that perhaps that as well could be a principle that's brought to bear in those particular situations. Now, as far as how to call people out when they're doing that, I'm not sure that I have very good advice. In the book, I also talk about not getting defensive. That's advice that I think is much easier to give than to take. And maybe that's another book that somebody with a different expertise can write about how to talk to people about when they're being offensive without having to get defensive. Very different.
Hi. Oh, sorry.
No, Francesca.
Okay. This is such a great talk. Thank you so much for being here. And I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, so it's on order. I'm super excited. I have a question then about it, and I think you might already address it. So I feel like the example of the racial photoshopping in higher education is why I'm really excited about this book. Is it gives me a language to talk about PragerU videos. So I do a lot of work on right-wing media production, and their PragerU videos are really good at this, right? So they take a person of whom matches the identity that they're trying to talk about, and then they're like, Muslims are bad for America, and then they have a Muslim woman like, as part of the video, but that seems so different, right? This element of consent or like for whom gains, I feel like is sort of a different question here. And so I'm wondering, do you tackle at all this difference between the kid at Wisconsin, who I'm assuming did not consent to his photo being photoshopped
He did not
into
consent. In fact, he filed a lawsuit because he didn't have
No, which you shouldn't. So I feel like do you kind of talk about these complexities between this very non-consensual racial photoshopping that I see is very prevalent versus this like what I think is still the same idea of identity capitalism, but seems very different to me. And then the other question I had, if I don't mind, I'm just gonna throw a second one in there, is like the role of diversity statements in higher education. And I just love your thoughts. And you can just pass them if you don't want, but
Yeah.
Very.
Question.
I'm sorry,
Another blockchain question in this topic.
the blockchain.
So like the like one that you read the
don't.
Oh, no, you don't want to, yeah, go ahead.
No, I have big thoughts on diversity.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm happy to talk about them. I mean, really, both of these questions, I think, draw on a concept that I wanted to make sure that there's enough time for questions. So I did talk about another concept that I developed in the book, which is the concept of the identity entrepreneur, right? So I focused very much on identity capitalists who are individual and institutional members of in-groups who are extracting value from members of out-groups. But out-group members are not always just like, kind of like these meek, passive little pawns, right? Like there's a whole range of ways for an out-group member who's been the target of identity capitalism to respond. At one end, we have filing a lawsuit, right? At the other end, we have what I would call the identity capitalist, or I'm sorry, the identity entrepreneur, the identity entrepreneur. And as I define it in the book, an identity entrepreneur is a member of an out-group who leverages their out-group identity to acquire some of the benefits that the in-group has to offer. So to give maybe a slightly dated example of an identity entrepreneur, I think Sarah Palin was an identity entrepreneur. I mean, she brought up all the time that she was a woman running for office and said things like, well, the Democrats claim to be the party that supports women. If that's true, then why are we the only party that has a woman on the ticket, right? So I would call that identity entrepreneurship, right? Like she's leveraging her identity as a woman to get some of the benefits that the in-group has to offer, such as the vice presidency, a future reality show, all of those kinds of things. So I think that the identity entrepreneur issue comes into play with respect to diversity statements, because I think that diversity statements are an invitation for members of out-groups. It's an invitation for members of out-groups to become identity entrepreneurs. So the way that could happen is that the diversity statement invites, or I would almost say mandates, a member of an out-group to talk about their out-group identity. I think that many out-group members know that if they don't talk about the identity characteristics that are going to be most salient to an admissions committee, the admissions committee may not give them all the benefits that they could otherwise have. The admissions committee might even think that it's weird. So if I was writing my diversity statement, I would kind of feel like I had to talk about being an Asian American woman, right? Even if I wanted instead to talk about something like, I grew up in Colorado, what rurality meant to me, what it was like to go to Chicago at a time when I'd really not been to that many big cities. Maybe I want to talk about something else in my diversity statement, but because of the fact of the diversity statement and what I probably correctly perceive the expectations of the admissions committee to be, I would kind of feel like I had this choice between either not meeting those expectations or almost being required to become an identity entrepreneur and leverage these aspects of my out-group identity in a way that would appeal to the admissions committee. So I think that there's this element of double bind. I also think, and this goes a little bit outside what I really talk about in the book, but I also think that diversity statements advantage the same people that are always advantaged. Like, I'm going to talk about this in kind of a general way, but I chaired our appointment committee last year, and I think that it's fine to say that some of the very best diversity statements that I saw were from white candidates who had a lot of advantages, including being able to show their diversity statements to a lot of people, perhaps including people of color, who helped them make them better. And so I'm not sure that diversity statements are necessarily, at least in all situations, having the effect that that advocates might hope that they will. So that was kind of a mouthful on diversity statements. And I'm interested to hear others' thoughts on diversity statements. I mean, I think these things to some extent are institutionally specific. And then your other question, well, I think that So the concept of the entrepreneur, yeah, and so, you know, I mean, you could imagine a different Black student who, upon, you know, finding himself unwittingly photoshopped into these university promotional materials, could, well, could take all sorts of other recourse. Like if somebody else noticed the Photoshop, you could imagine this student saying, you know what, I don't mind them Photoshopping them because I really appreciate the education that I've gotten here. Well, before long, the student will probably find himself everywhere on the website, right? He'll probably be in a video. Maybe he'll have a role within the admissions office. Like you could imagine a situation, and I don't know exactly how it would play out, but you could imagine a situation where that same student would say, you know what, I'm going to turn this situation to my advantage. I'm not going to file a lawsuit. I'm going to actually leverage my identity even more, right? And encourage the university to continue to use this way. So I think the concept of the identity entrepreneur is complicated. In the book, this is the last thing I'll say. In the book, I talk about how I think identity capitalism is usually not a good thing. I think identity entrepreneurs are more complicated because of things like individual agency, right? And you know, diversity among or diversity within a particular outgroup. That's what I'm trying to say. So I think the concept of the identity entrepreneur is a little more complicated. Yeah.
Hey, this is really interesting. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about interim measures, maybe not on the macro level, because when I see that picture now, I mean, I hadn't seen it in a while, but when I see that Wisconsin brochure now, the thing that comes to my mind is a robust set of name, image, and likeness rights for underrepresented people, right? And that's not going to solve the problem, but it does give, you know, people like this student an opportunity to kind of claw back maybe some of the identity capital that's been taken from them. And then the second question is on the white adjacent, which I also relate to. Is there anything special or different we learned from mixed race actors who are kind of going back and forth in the system between group and outgroup?
Oh, I love both of these questions a lot. I'll take them in reverse order. So in terms of mixed race actors, I think that mixed race actors are in an interesting position because in terms of identity entrepreneurship, right? Mixed race actors have the opportunity to be identity entrepreneurs with respect to their race. So if somebody is, let's say, racially ambiguous or sometimes identified as a person of color based on their name, sometimes identified as white based on their name, look, whatever it might be, there's more choice. There's a little more agency there in some situations about whether that person wants to become an identity entrepreneur or alternatively an identity capitalist, right? Like if somebody is, we'll just go ahead and stay with the phrase white adjacent. If somebody is white adjacent, then I think that often means that that person has access to some of the relative power, privilege, and status that comes with being white. And so at least relative to some other members of Russian groups, has more of an opportunity to engage in what we might call identity capitalist or even exploitative some situations. And so I think that mixed race people have more opportunities. We could say that mixed race people have more opportunities in some ways, but maybe fewer opportunities in some ways. Like if somebody, let's say, is visually identified as white, just to give an example, maybe a school doesn't think they contribute as much to diversity because they don't look as nice when they're photoshopped into a photo, or when they're, well, it doesn't have to be photoshopped. A photo of them is on the website. Like I've heard Indigenous students express this kind of frustration, like I wasn't Indian enough for them, right? So I think that it's a really interesting situation when somebody can kind of move between categories in a fluid way, and to think about the way that sometimes that enlarges options, trains them. And then in terms of interim measures, you know, I think name, image, and likeness is promising, although I honestly don't know very much about that particular remedy. I have been, for all the years that I've been talking about, first my racial capitalism article, and then this identity capitalism book, as I've gone around the country talking about chapters, I've always floated the idea that the real problem is that people who are being asked to engage in some form of identity work are not being adequately compensated for it. So to give an example, one time pretty early in my teaching career, not necessarily at my current school, I taught at another school before the University of Denver. There was a photographer in one of my classes for like half the class period. And at one point I noticed him kind of crunching himself like into a corner. And I realized it was because he wanted to get a photo that had both me and the one black student at the same time. That photo, guess where that photo ended up? And so this was distracting for me. It was distracting for, I would guess, the students. And so maybe the problem is not that the school did it, but that the school did it without asking me and compensating for it. Like maybe they should have compensated me. I don't know, what would be the appropriate amount of compensation? $10,000. Summer salary, an extra research assistant. No, whatever it might be, right? Like this is actual additional labor that I was asked to do or kind of conscripted into doing that my white colleagues were not asked to do. My students also frequently tell me stories from the law firms where they are summer associates, where they explain that or not just summer associates, they're associates. Like one woman who was the only Black associate at her law firm for a long time said, I have to be in every interview involving a candidate who is not white, because the law firm needs to signal to this candidate that there are other people of color here, right? So again, this is extra work for this associate, and it's work for which she's not being compensated. So I think that another idea, Enrique, would be to fit some of this into a discourse not of how do we make this stop, but how do we ensure that people who tend to be pulled into this process, how do we make sure that they're adequately compensated? I know that at some schools there's a conversation going on right now about unseen labor, and I think that this could be seen as part of the faculty members and maybe students, for which there could be some kind of reasonable way to create some kind of compensation, whether it's monetary. Maybe your books should be paid for if you're a student and you're getting put in photos all the time. I don't know what it would be, but that might be part of the conversation as well. You had a follow-up question, and then well. Yeah, please go ahead. I couldn't tell. I'm sorry. I'm not very good at watching the order of things. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I just was like thinking it really dovetailed into honesty, like even not just even compensation, but saying after pictures are taken, contacting students and saying, I want to use this part of promotional material. Like they don't even recognize that their images are being used while they're in class for a course that they paid for. So I think like just even in the spirit of honesty, which you talk about in your talk, like compensation plus a notification that we had a photographer and we want to use this, that gives people the agency to opt out of their photographs being used.
Yeah, or you can imagine. So I think that allowing people to opt out would be good. You could also imagine a world in which the caption says this person was paid $50 or whatever it might be, right? Some sort of opportunity to opt out, I think, would cure a lot of.
So anyway, I agree. Great talk. This is super generative. I think along those lines, and well, I guess Lee left, but something Lee said about sort of the capitalism angle of this I kept thinking throughout your presentation about just the differential rates of return, right? That various people are sort of gathering from the identity capitalism part. So in this particular case, right, of the photographs, it's the institution that's benefiting disproportionately, right, from this identity capitalist practice, because in essence, you can think about what returns do they get from those photographs. Well, they're able to get more applicants that benefits them, right? Perhaps they want more applicants so they can have more people to reject, which makes their selection rate like look smaller, more narrower, right? So like, and across your cases, I guess like I kept coming back to this question of sort of like, what is the return? Because it looks very different across very different cases. Like, so in the Bonilla Silva story you told, right?
Yeah.
People might get like a sense of maybe psychological well-being, or they could tell a story to them. But those people are sitting within a much larger racial order of racial capitalism that's in essence exploiting those feelings, because it's creating social differentiation that, yes, they're benefiting from as white people, but certainly not as much as those white corporations are benefiting by tasking their white employees to do diversity work, right? So this isn't really a question so much as it is a question. I was wondering if you sort of think about in the book, those escalating rates of return and how institutions versus individuals versus groups all benefit just very disproportionately from these types of practices, but in ways that look very different across them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does make sense. And I've never really understood the objection to comments rather than questions. I don't know, sometimes comments help. I think this is a terrific comment. You know, I don't know that I have much of a response to the question, except to say that I agree. I do see the same pattern, although I like the idea of like these escalating rates of return. Nobody's ever heard like that before in all the years, in the like decade that I've been talking about this. And so I think that there's an interesting interplay here between identity capitalism and literal economic capitalism, where I think the escalating rates of return for identity capitalism are enabled by the structures that are in place as a result of literal capitalism. And so, you know, you could imagine a follow-up project that talks about the clash of capitalisms or something like that. I mean, I really struggled over the terminology. Not everybody's been on board with it. I felt that capital kind of brought together the idea of social and human and other forms of capital, just any kind of valuism. You might be trying to acquire some kind of status or something like that. But when you kind of put that head to head with just you know, literal powerful people and institutions are able to extract more literal dollar value because of the way the whole system of capitalism is set up. I mean, I think that that's a very powerful way to look at it. So thank you.
One reason I really like it, I mean, just so in a lot of your examples, you sort of shade from the individual to the institution. Like, so let's run with your photographer example, right? So that student photographer is probably a low-wage work study student who clearly is being told to produce a certain set of photos, or he's just internalized, or she's internalized, or they've internalized, like, what is the good photo here, right?
Yeah.
So yes, so it's sort of like, I'm sure there's almost an exploitation of identity work in this way too, where like people labor to produce things that then institutions extract value from, if that like, so it's working across those levels.
Or we could talk about you know, like the relatively like low-level event staff at a rally who are told to you know, go find people of color and make sure they stand behind the candidate so the cameras can see them. I mean, they may not even want to do that. They may think that no, like I don't really want to do that, but they have to because they're getting paid, right? And they want to get paid.
That's why the capital metaphor works so perfectly, I think. Anyway, great job. I love it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Is there any, sorry, Nancy, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I just noticed the time.
Yeah, is there any final questions? Any thoughts? Okay, well, please join me in thanking Professor Leong for joining us. And we have another talk coming up in November. I can't remember the exact date. It's November 10th, same time, same place. And Tamara Knopper will be talking about, I believe, credit scoring and racial inequality and credit scores. So it should be super interesting as well. All right, thanks everyone for coming.